In 1600, Asia was the most powerful region of the world. Many Asians were relatively prosperous. Asia's population was 3 times as numerous as the population of Europe, but Western travelers like Marco Polo found that the Indians and Chinese were at least as well off as the peasants of southern Europe, while Asian rulers were fabulously rich. Even in the mountainous areas of China and in Japan, there was still land left for cultivation and expansion, while in India at that time, at least 30% of the good arable land remained untilled. Yet by 1800, large tracts of India and Southeast Asia were controlled by Europeans, and China and Japan seemed increasingly vulnerable to Western influence. Why was this? The answer lies as much in the internal political and economic problems of the great Asian powers as in the expansionist ambitions of the European states. At that time, the rulers of India and Asia were fabulously rich and powerful, and led lives of exotic luxury. It was Asia, and not Europe, which was the center of world industry. Central and southern China supported factories in which tens of thousands of craftsmen designed and made fine ceramics. Chinese pottery is still amongst the most prized in the world. Only a little porcelain and china, suitably vulgarized to adapt it for European tastes, found its way to London and to Amsterdam in the great East Indiaman, which sailed the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. India at that time was the center of the world's textile industry. Drawing on centuries of skill and cheap labor, textiles from Bengal in the east and Gujarat in the west dominated world trade. Indian printed cloths, chintzes, were the rage in the England of Queen Anne's day, and Indian artisans, like the Chinese, skillfully adapted their manufactures to European taste and offered a wide range of patterns and types of decoration. It was Asia's economic vitality which first attracted European adventurers. In the 17th century, the Portuguese and then the Dutch established trade routes across the Indian Ocean. The Europeans achieved this dominance at sea because the great Asian states were not very interested in maritime power. The Mughal Empire and the empires of Ming China and of Japan were land-based and apparently impregnable. Europeans conquered no major territories in Asia before 1800, and when the Europeans did make conquests, these were peripheral territories. The great Asian powers were not much concerned. After all, China had a population of nearly 150 million. India about 120 million. The population of the whole of Europe was only about 80 million in 1600. 70% of the world's population lived on the Asian landmass, and in Asia at that time political power stemmed from military command of the overland trade routes and fertile inland territories. The oceans and the coastal zones were not important. In China, before 1600, the Ming emperors had limited overseas trade. The natural frontiers of China were the great inland plains and mountain ranges, not the ocean. The Portuguese and the Jesuits who came with them were only allowed to set up one base in China, at Macau, whence they controlled the European carrying trade between China and Japan. For cultured Asians, Europeans remained exotic marvels on the fringes of their world. To the Chinese, the Portuguese and Dutch were the long-nosed red barbarians from beyond the sea. A chronicler of the early 17th century noted contemptuously, "These barbarians do not even know how to eat with chopsticks, and open their legs while sitting." Some said that they killed and consumed human babies as a delicacy. Foreigners were an endless source of amusement to Japanese gentlemen. Yet Asian rulers were fascinated by the mechanical devices and medical skills which Europeans possessed. Clocks were among the artifacts used to impress the Chinese, and Europeans who could explain how they worked were much sought after in the East. Portuguese Jesuits like Matteo Ricci and Ferdinand Verbeest expounded both horology and astronomy at the Chinese imperial court. Johannes Adam Schouw von Bell was director of the Imperial Board of Astronomy, and since astronomy was at the heart of the theory of Chinese kingship, it was men like this that Peking appreciated and encouraged. In India, too, the Jesuits gained influence at the court of the great Emperor Akbar and his son Jehangir. In this allegorical miniature, European influence and power are suggested by the portrait of King James I found in the corner. But the political and religious influence of the Europeans was strictly limited. The Mughal court turned back to exclusively Islamic practices during the reign of the last great Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb, at the end of the 17th century. At the same time, the Indians came to covet European weapons, whether for sporting or military purposes, and they traded eagerly for silver from the Americas, some of which they used for the ceremonial weighing of their princes. Trading concessions on the Indian coast were granted in turn to the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Danes, the French, and eventually the English. As the first factors of the English company gazed despairingly across the forlorn acres of gloomy swampland granted to them by the Mughal emperor in 1633, they little dreamed that this would one day be Calcutta, the second city of the greatest of all the European empires, the British Empire of Queen Victoria. The Queen Victoria Memorial still stands in Calcutta to this day. The limits of European influence were most strikingly demonstrated in Japan. The great barons of the coastal lands and the outer domains welcomed the trade which the Portuguese brought, and they allowed the Portuguese freedom to make Christian converts. By 1600 there were as many as 1.5 million Christians in Japan, but the political balance then changed. New rulers unified the country and established a system of centralized feudalism under Buddhism and Shinto. Christianity was regarded as subversive, and between 1606 and 1660, thousands of Christians were martyred, and the Portuguese were expelled from the country. Under the shogunate of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the Japanese warrior classes restored the centralized Japanese state. They adapted very quickly to the European challenge and used volleys of musket fire to deter European aggressors. They were so formidable at defending themselves that they were able to afford the luxury of ritualizing and beautifying the arts of war. The samurai sword was the sharpest instrument in the world for several centuries, an art form in itself as well as a lethal weapon. Even the scabbards had to be beautiful as well as functional. Japanese warriors were more than a match for the European merchants and missionaries who attempted to intrude. The Japanese were not totally isolated during the 17th and 18th centuries. A Dutch ship visited the port of Nagasaki once a year, and Russian envoys attempted to make contact. But Japan needed little from the West. By 1800, as much as 20% of Japan's population lived in bustling, prosperous towns like Kyoto. Internal trade was promoted by the excellent system of roads. The coastal routes also linked the domains of the feudal barons with the cities of Kyoto, Osaka, and the imperial palace at Edo, now called Tokyo, where the barons were required to reside for 6 months of every year. For several centuries, the country was internally at peace and prosperous, until Commodore Perry and his American naval squadron arrived to bully it into trade concessions in 1853. For China, the 19th and 20th centuries brought Western invasion and humiliation. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was not possible for China to isolate itself from the West. Why did this great xenophobic monarchy, which still treated Europeans with haughty contempt as late as 1800, decline so quickly? The physical and political energy which sustained the fabric of Chinese society ebbed and flowed regularly for more than 2 millennia, as one imperial dynasty succeeded another each 200 or 300 years. By 1640, the Qing dynasty from Manchuria had replaced the Ming emperors and consolidated power over central and southern China after more than half a century of war. At this time, Chinese society was organized and administered by the scholar gentry, recruited from the class of petty landlords through an examination system, which passed on classical Confucian culture from generation to generation. This picture is called Young Scholars Waiting for Their Exam Results. The development over 3 millennia of the written language of the Chinese, with pictures growing into symbols, created a flexible tool, independent of any spoken language or dialect with which to govern China. The language itself helped to draw together an intellectual elite composed of many different races and from many linguistic regions. As the cycle of the Qing dynasty matured, new territory was conquered, making Qing China by 1760 the largest nation in the world. But China faced problems of a new order. In 1400, China's population was about 65 million. In 1600, about 150 million. And in 1800, 320 million. A food crisis was almost inevitable. The ancient imperial bureaucracy, staffed by mandarins, knew little of agriculture. Chinese technology was adapted to the needs of the imperial court, and it was incapable of relieving the growing food problem. During the 18th century, rebellions broke out all over China, in the poorer territories of the north and west, and in the rich rice-producing lands of the south. Secret societies flourished in the reign of the Emperor Qianlong, who died in 1795. But even at that stage, with a crisis pending, the Chinese emperors treated foreigners with contempt. George III sent Lord Macartney as his envoy to Peking, and he was shocked by the indifference with which he was received. It was just at that time that the import of opium to China was beginning. The opium, which helped to destroy China, came mainly from British India, with the support of the British authorities. Internal rebellion and external pressure tore the Chinese empire to pieces during the 19th century. Most of Southeast Asia remained untouched by European expansion until the 19th century. Australia was not explored at all before 1770. But there were some major European conquests in the East Indies. The Spaniards conquered the Philippines in 1765. The French had a foothold in Indochina by 1780. But it was Holland which was the most important European power in the area, and on the rich and populous island of Java, over which they had virtually complete control by 1690, generations of Dutch traders made themselves very much at home. The powerful Muslim states, which had developed as Islam traveled down the trade routes from Western Asia, resisted European incursions. Aceh in Sumatra, Mataram in Java, and Johor in southern Malaysia remained independent at first. The Hindu-Buddhist states on the mainland survived longer. They succeeded in maintaining their vivid and distinct cultural lives while fighting off European influence until the end of the 19th century. It was India which was the first great Asian country to fall prey to direct colonial occupation. Again, the reason lay as much in the nature of its society as in the military strength of the British in the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. When European travellers first came to India, they were impressed and daunted by the power of the Mughal emperors. But the Mughal Empire was, at best, a fragile despotism. The Mughal emperors were lords of the roads and open plains. Their writ ran only where their armies could travel. Their rule depended on two things. First, the acquiescence of upwards of 150 million Hindu peasant farmers and petty landlords who paid their military commanders a tax on agricultural produce in silver rupees. Secondly, the emperors needed to satisfy with resources and honor the soldiers who served them. To arm and pay their warriors was as much as most emperors could manage. In the 1670s and 1680s, the Emperor Aurangzeb started to push his armies to the south, swallowing the remaining independent Muslim states and coercing the Hindu landlords in an attempt to stabilize his empire. This was to prove disastrous. The empire overextended itself. After Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the Muslim governors of 4 provinces became independent, and the fierce Sikhs in the Punjab and the Hindu Marathas rebelled. In 1739, the Persians invaded across the Hindu Kush and slaughtered 30,000 people on the streets of Delhi. Even the peacock throne of the Mughal emperors was carried off to Persia, where it remained for over 200 years. Wishing to protect their trade in Indian textiles, the British merchants gathered in the trading towns of Calcutta, Madras and Surat, and gradually increased their military and economic control over the new Indian states which emerged out of the wreckage of the Mughal Empire. In the south, the British supported Muhammad Ali Walaja against his French-backed rivals in the wars of 1739 to 60. In 1757, in the eastern province of Bengal, Robert Clive, the son of a petty squire from Shropshire, staged a momentous coup against the local viceroy of the Mughal Empire and seized a prize worth £2 million per annum for Britain, the land tax of the whole of Bengal. Over the next 40 years, British dominion and the influence of British trade spread inexorably through India. The greatest leap forward came during the Revolutionary Wars with France. Between 1799 and 1806, the future Duke of Wellington and his brother conquered Britain's remaining Indian enemies, the Marathas in the west and the Sultan of Mysore in the south. Tipu, Sultan of Mysore, hated the British and owned this gruesome model of a tiger devouring a British soldier, with sound effects. True to his maxim, better to live a day like a tiger than a lifetime as a sheep, Tipu died in the final assault on his capital in 1799. Europeans dominated Asia between 1800 and 1950. The old Chinese Empire was completely undermined by European pressure from without and peasant rebellion from within. Chinese nationalists deposed the last emperor in 1911, and between 1911 and 1949, China became a battlefield of warring internal factions and foreign invaders. The result was not only human suffering on a massive scale, with millions of people dying of starvation in the streets, but the virtual abnegation of China's political role in the world during a crucial period of recent history. Instead of the Chinese, it was the Japanese who became the first Asiatic power in modern times to adopt an aggressive expansionist policy. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was followed by substantial incursions into China and later on into the rest of Asia. Japan was forged into a war machine, and the suicidal enthusiasm for battle amongst the young Japanese daunted and defeated many of the Europeans who encountered it during the Second World War. Japan had begun to modernize and reinvigorate its state and its armies in the 1870s, when it was enraged by external threats and pressures from Russia, the European powers, and the Americans. Japan's aggressive military posture between 1930 and 1945 was an attempt to strike back. In India, nationalist movements gathered momentum during the Second World War. The British abandoned their largest colonial possession in 1947 and left the Indians to govern themselves. In China, the communist victory in 1949 resulted in a huge redistribution of land to benefit the peasantry and stimulate agriculture. Under the leadership of Mao Zedong, China gradually became a major industrial power, and now, once again, China has the potential of feeding and organizing its vast population. Japan, which failed to emulate the West through imperialism, has now done so through industry. The yen is triumphantly strong, and in the last 20 years, Japanese products have not only dominated Asian markets, but have invaded Europe and North America. Asia, always the most populous continent in the world, now seems to be in the process of regaining its former economic dominance.